Hi guys, my name is Oliver Mashuma and I'm a student at Africa University in my second year, first semester. And welcome to my presentation on the law of delict, but more specifically on the concept of fault within the law of delict.
Okay, so fault in the law of delict. The law of delict is part of the law concerned with civil wrongs or actions that cause harm to another person or their property. The law of delict is intended to recompense victims for their losses and to dissuade persons from repeating similar acts in the future. The law of delict derives from Roman law, which established a system of remedies for victims of civil wrongs. These remedies included compensating those affected for their losses and punishing the perpetrator. The common law system later adopted delict law and established its own set of rules and concepts for dealing with civil wrongs. The law of delict is now a complex and evolving area of law, and it is constantly being updated to reflect the change in society. Yeah, and now we'll move on to the key elements that were mentioned earlier. And as you can see, the key elements, we've got 4 of them. Earlier in the introduction, I mentioned 3, but then I decided to add another one, which is the last one, which is determining fault, just to better explain the topic. Okay, so for our key elements, we have the first one, which is establishing fault, and basically this is how fault is established. What do you need to establish fault? Who has to establish fault? Is it the plaintiff? Is it the defendant? And obviously in this case it's the plaintiff, because they have to prove they've been wronged. And then you've got the two main types of fault, and that's intention and negligence. So we're going to look at those two separately. And then you've got strict liability, which is another way fault can be imposed. Fault can be imposed through strict liability. And as I mentioned before, strict liability can be imposed through statutes or through common law. And then lastly, the last key element is determining fault. And this is basically how fault is determined in the court of law. Okay, so we'll move on to what is fault. And fault in the law of delict refers to the legal concept that holds individuals responsible for their actions or omissions that cause harm to others. It is an essential element in establishing liability for damages in a delictual claim. Fault is one of the requirements for conduct to constitute a delict, which makes it a key concept in the law of delict. It is the element that distinguishes a civil wrong from a criminal offense. In the case of Nyaguse versus Skinner's auto body specialist and another, the court established that the fault element must be specifically pleaded in all Aquilian actions. And in another case of Ndlovu versus Debshan, the court echoes similar sentiments and has said that the plaintiff must be the one to establish a wrongful act or omission along with fault in the form of either negligence or intention as the fault requirement is that it must be proved that the defendant caused the harm in an intentional manner or in a negligent manner. And that ties in perfectly with what our... Okay, but first, before we move on to intention and negligence, we have to go through our first key element first, and that is establishing liability. And in order to establish liability, it is necessary to prove that the defendant acted with fault. This means that the defendant either acted intentionally or negligently, resulting in harm to the plaintiffs. So again, this echoes the same sentiments mentioned in the case that I had mentioned before, the case of Ndlovu versus Debshan, where it says the plaintiff must establish a wrongful act or omission along with fault in the form of either negligent or intention, as the fault requirement is that it must be proved that the defendant caused the harm in an intentional manner or in a negligent manner. So now we'll move on to the two kinds of fault, and that's intention and negligence. And with intentional fault occurs when the defendant deliberately engages in conduct that they know will cause harm to another person. This can include actions such as assault, defamation, or intentional infliction of emotional distress. And negligence, on the other hand, occurs when the defendant fails to exercise the level of care that a reasonable person would have exercised in similar circumstances. Negligence can arise from actions or omissions that fall below the standard of care expected in a particular situation. Okay, so now that we have the two different kinds of fault, I'll start off by diving into the detail of and explaining negligence. And negligence, being a form of fault in the law of delict, is the failure to take reasonable care to avoid causing harm to another person or their property, as mentioned before. And most equivalent actions are based on negligence claims. And in order to prove negligence, the test that is applied is the objective standard of the reasonable person. The reasonable man is merely fictitious and is a concept that is created by the law in order to set a uniform standard of determining what constitutes as negligence. In order for the reasonable man to truly be a uniform standard, he is not exceptionally gifted, skilled, careful, or developed. Neither is he underdeveloped nor someone who recklessly takes risks or who has no prudence. The qualities of the reasonable man are said to be in between the two extremes that I have just mentioned. So with this information, the courts are the ones who decide what a reasonable man would have done in a certain situation. And since negligence claims basically repeat themselves over time, like similar cases they keep on coming back around, the courts have previous court decisions that have been issued, and they can use those as precedents in order to help them to make certain decisions in certain situations. So negligence is thus failing to display a similar degree of care in avoiding the infliction of harm which the reasonable person would have displayed in similar circumstances, and the plaintiff must be able to fulfill the requirements of the negligence criterion, which are that he must show that the defendant owed them a duty of care, that the defendant breached their duty, that the breach of duty caused the plaintiff's harm, and that the plaintiff suffered damages as a result. So these criteria they have to be proven in order for the plaintiff to receive damages and to receive compensation. And also, under the topic of negligence, we have a very important subtopic, and that's foreseeability. And foreseeability is an important element of negligence because in order to determine negligence, two main questions are asked, which are whether the harm was reasonably foreseeable and what steps would a reasonable person have taken in order to guard against the harm occurring. So, in order to prove negligence, the plaintiff must show that the defendant could have foreseen the harm that was caused. This means that the defendant should have known that their actions or omissions could have caused harm to someone else. And there are many different subsets of reasonability, with the first one being reasonable foreseeability. So what is reasonable foreseeability? And reasonable foreseeability simply poses the question that was harm reasonably foreseeable? And we have some case law on this topic, and this is the case of Whittam versus Minister of Home Affairs, where a mentally unstable policeman was given a gun and an assignment to guard a house, but ended up wandering off and shooting some civilians. The ministry was found to be negligent as it gave the policeman in question a gun whilst knowing of his mental state, as it was reasonably foreseeable that he might end up harming civilians due to his mental state. And also, this was proven. The fault criterion was met because the ministry owed a duty of care to the public, and they breached their duty of care. So that's the first subset of foreseeability. Another subset of foreseeability is the foreseeability of general nature of harm and general manner of it occurring. And this subset focuses on the issue that it is not imperative for the extent of the damage or the exact nature of the damage to be reasonably foreseeable for one to be liable. Instead, what is essential is that the general nature and the general extent of the harm to be reasonably foreseeable. And this is proven in the case of Minister of Police versus Van Aswegen, whereby police officers were transporting a prisoner in a vehicle, and the prisoner attempted to escape. And in the process of the attempted escape, the police officers lost control of the vehicle and collided with an oncoming vehicle that was carrying cattle. The collision caused injuries to the cattle, and the police officers were found liable for that damage, as the courts ruled that the attempted escape made by the prisoner that caused the collision was reasonably foreseeable. So in this case, as you just heard, it was reasonably foreseeable that the prisoner might try to escape. So even though it wasn't reasonably foreseeable that in the process of a prisoner trying to escape, they might lose control of the car and then crash into a car transporting cattle, even though that part wasn't reasonably foreseeable, it was reasonably foreseeable that the prisoner might try to escape, and because of that, liability was incurred. And also still on the topic of foreseeability, one of the most pertinent questions when it comes to this topic is that must harm to the plaintiff be reasonable? This means that is it enough for the plaintiff to only be a part of a class of persons who might be affected by the negligence in question? Zimbabwean law views negligence as a directional or relative concept, and therefore for the plaintiff to be able to claim damages and for there to be delictual liability, the plaintiff has to be able to prove that the negligent acts were done in relation to him. And negligence in these types of situations is referred to as negligence in error, and negligence in error is said to be insufficient to found delictual liability. So in the case of local authorities pension fund versus Nyakawa and others, whereby the plaintiff had employees who stole funds from the pension fund and connived with employees of a bank to store those funds in fictitious bank accounts, the plaintiff brought an action against the bank and claimed that the bank was negligent as it allowed its employees to create fictitious accounts to store illegally sourced money. The bank accepted the claim by pointing to the fact that it had no duty of care which it owed to the plaintiff, as the plaintiff was not a customer to the bank. The courts agreed with the bank as they held that for negligence to be present, there had to have been a duty of care which was breached, and in this situation the bank did not owe a duty of care to the plaintiff, as the plaintiff was not a customer of the bank. The courts ruled this to be a case of negligence in error, and that the negligent acts that may have been committed by the bank were not done in relation to the plaintiff, and therefore the negligence in error was insufficient to found delictual liability. So this just proves how Zimbabwean courts view negligence, because as what I said before, they view it as a relative concept. So whatever harm that is done, it must be done in relation to you. That's the only way you can claim damages. Otherwise, it can't be general. It has to have a specific relation to you. So if you want to claim damages or claim compensation, you have to prove their relation. That's one of the things the plaintiff must prove. And the other pertinent question which is asked in order to determine negligence in relation to foreseeability, as mentioned prior, is whether the harm was reasonably foreseeable and what steps would a reasonable person have taken in order to guard against the harm occurring. And in addition, a fire started on the property of the defendant, whereby he had allowed his land to overgrow with grass, making it a fire hazard, which caused damage to the property of the plaintiff. The defendant incurred liability on the basis that it was reasonably foreseeable that a fire might start and spread to other properties in close proximity to the defendant's property, and was also ruled that a reasonable person would have taken the inexpensive and easy precaution of cutting the grass to a point where it would not cause as much harm. So that is it on the topic of negligence. So now we move on to intention. So we're going to look at intention in a more detailed manner like we've just done for negligence. Okay, so with intention or intent, we're already given the definition of what intent is, and it's on the screen right now, as you can see. So in the case of Dante's Investment Holdings versus Brenner, intent is deemed to be present when a person's will is directed at a result which he causes whilst being conscious of the wrongfulness of his conduct. This definition clearly prescribes that intention has two elements to it, which are direction of the will and conscious knowledge of the wrongfulness of one's actions. The direction of will element points to the direction of the will of the defendant to a result which was either his main objective or was an outcome that that the defendant reasonably foresaw could happen as a result of his conduct. There are three types of intent that can be identified, which are as follows. You've got direct intent, which is your dolus directus, and then you've got indirect intent, which is dolus indirectus, and you've got dolus eventualis. And direct intent refers to an individual's purpose, and it is where the defendant embarks on a course of conduct to bring about a result which actually occurs. It is irrelevant whether the defendant was certain of the outcome or if he thought the outcome to be probable. And then you've got indirect intent. Indirect intent, on the other hand, is where the defendant directly intends to cause a certain outcome, but has knowledge that another outcome may inevitably occur due to his conduct. And lastly, you've got dolus eventualis, and this is when the defendant does not desire a certain outcome, but reconciles himself with the fact that his conduct may cause the result and proceeds with that conduct. And although a distinction is made between the different types of intent, when it comes to the law of delict, it is generally irrelevant which one is present in a particular case. The other element of intent, which is the conscious knowledge of wrongfulness, indicates that it is not enough for a person to direct their will at accomplishing a certain result, but they must also realize that their conduct is wrong, or at least reasonably foresee that their conduct is wrong. And in the case of Alex Hooks versus Rand Carroll Hatting, the defendant was found to be intellectually liable for the injuries sustained by the plaintiff during a rugby game, as he was found not only to have intent to hurt the plaintiff, but also found to have had consciousness of the wrongfulness, as he had used an illegal maneuver during a scrum in a rugby game, which resulted in neck injuries for the plaintiff. So now that we're done with intention or intent, we move on to strict liability. And strict liability, with strict liability, like with most delictual actions in our jurisdiction, proof of fault is required, but there are few strict actions where that is not the case. So strict liability is a type of liability in which a person or entity is held responsible for the damages caused by their actions. For the damages caused by their actions, even if they were not negligent. Strict liability is often used in cases where the defendant's actions are inherently dangerous or where the defendant has a special relationship with the plaintiff. And with strict liability, it can either be imposed by statute or by common law. And in Zimbabwe, we've got the two most prominent acts which impose strict liability for delictual damages. In Zimbabwe, we've got the Road Traffic Act and we've got the Civil Aviation Act. And Section 38B of the Road Traffic Act provides for compulsory no-fault liability insurance to cover any deaths or injuries that may occur to public vehicle passengers. And the Civil Aviation Act provides for the recovery of damages from the owner of an aircraft without any proof of negligence, where material loss and damages are caused to any person or property on land or water by an aircraft whilst it's flying or landing or taking off by a person falling from an aircraft whilst it's taking off, landing or flying. So damages are claimable in these situations without proof of fault on the owner's part unless the victim caused or contributed to the damage suffered. And in these situations, the owner of an aircraft is only exonerated from liability if for some other reason legal liability is transferred from the owner to another person to pay damages. So after strict liability, which is imposed by statute, now we've got strict liability, which is imposed by common law. And a main example of this is vicarious liability. And vicarious liability simply means that an employer is liable for all delicts committed by his employees, and for the employer to be liable for his employees' actions, the delictual acts have to be committed within the scope of the work of the employees and during their working hours. Fault on the part of the employer is irrelevant, as it does not have to be proved for the vicarious liability to be present. And vicarious liability is all encompassing because even if the employer neither knew nor should reasonably have known that the delict would be committed by his employee, the employer will still be held liable. And to add on to the all-encompassing nature of vicarious liability, it doesn't have to be pleaded in courts for it to apply, as shown in the case of Masia and another versus Salumba and another, whereby the court held the employer vicariously liable, even though the plaintiff never at any point had pleaded vicarious liability in their pleadings. On the face of it, it might seem as if this doctrine is harsh and overpowered and unfair towards employers. However, the following arguments are used to defend the doctrine. So, 1. It is argued that employers should be held accountable because since they use the people they hire to further their own financial interests, if those people are to make a mistake or were to make a mistake, then they should also be able to take on the financial losses that come with it because they use these people to make financial profits. So they should also be prepared to take financial losses through the actions of these same people that they hire. And another argument which supports this doctrine is that it is argued that the company raises the risk that the employees may cause harm to others by requiring them to engage in various work activities, and that employers have the power to control their employees. So one of the main reasons why vicarious liability exists is the fact that usually, and the last main reason why vicarious liability exists is that the employer is usually or always in a far better financial position to compensate the victim compared to an employee, and this because the employer is often a sizable enterprise rather than a single individual and can do a far better job of absorbing losses of this description by taking out insurance or by way of distribution of costs to customers by increasing the price of products or services. And the case of Mungofa versus Muderede supports these views on the rationale of the doctrine of vicarious liability, as it states that vicarious liability of employers is based on social policy, and that the most important reason why that is because a person who employs others to advance their own economic interests should also be prepared to incur liability for losses made in the course of the enterprise. Okay, so now we'll move on to our last key element, the fourth one, and that is determining fault. And on this topic, it's worth mentioning that the determination of fault is a complex matter and requires a careful analysis of the facts and legal principles. Courts consider various factors such as the foreseeability of harm and the defendant's knowledge and the degree of risk involved. So basically, determining fault is now bringing in all the things we've been talking about, from how to establish liability, like proving that there was some sort of intention there or some sort of negligence there, or trying to determine whether strict liability can be applied, whether it's by statute or whether it's by common law, and all this. So basically, determining fault is just a summary of everything we've gone over in this presentation, because you need all these factors in order to prove that there was fault, and in order for the defendant to incur liability, all these things have to be proved, such as was the harm foreseeable, as we talked about, under negligence, or the defendant's knowledge, this we talked about, under intention, and then you've got the degree of risk involved. This is also the reasonable man's test that we talked about, under negligence. So you need all these in order for fault to be determined in a court of law.